So why isn't the new condominium market collapsing even as an increasing number of investors are defaulting on their purchases on closing? That's what I wanted to chat about today. My name is John Pasalis. My team and I help buyers and sellers throughout the Toronto area make smarter real estate decisions. If you'd like to meet with me or my team, just click the link in the show notes below or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com. So to set up the stage, I think it's important to unpack what is happening in the new condo market and what makes it quite different from the resale market to better understand the dynamics we're seeing. So many of the condos that are completing now were bought 4 to 5 years ago, many of which were bought by investors actually looking to either flip them or rent them out, but the majority looking at flipping them. Now, at the time, 4 or 5 years ago, investors were paying a significant premium to what existing units were selling for. So, for example, a pre-construction condo investor would be paying, $1,400 a square foot for a pre-construction condo, when a very similar existing unit was selling across the street that had just completed for $1,000 a square foot. So there's a disconnect, but anywhere from 30 to 50% between what investors were paying for pre-construction condos versus existing resale condos. And the reason investors were paying this massive inflated price, is because they could leverage more. They could phase their deposits, and many of them just didn't have any intention of closing. They just saw pre-construction condos as a get-rich-quick scheme, easy way to make money, just flip it before it's done. They don't have to worry about tenants. They don't have to worry about anything like that. They don't have to get a mortgage. Many of them couldn't even qualify for a mortgage, so they bought pre-construction condos, expecting to make 200 grand in 2 years. So this is the speculation that fueled pre-construction condominiums and prices. Fast forward to today, many of the units that are completing now are not worth what the investors have paid for them. So imagine a pre-construction condo investor spends $1 million for a 600 square foot condo pre-construction 5 years ago. Today, that condo might only be worth 700,000 in the resale market. So as they go to close and they get their appraiser, the bank says the unit's only worth 700,000. You paid $1 million. There's a massive gap. Now, what some banks have been doing is basically bridging that gap with what we call in the industry blanket appraisal. So normally when the appraisal comes in below what you paid for it, the investor needs to cover the difference. Even though they've put down $200,000, say as a deposit, there's a $300,000 gap between what they paid and what they sold, what the unit is worth. And in those environments, typically the investor has to, fill that gap. With blanket appraisers, the banks basically turn a blind eye and they basically say, well, we're going to pretend this, $700,000 condo is actually worth what you paid for it, $1 million. So we'll give you, an 800,000 or 80% mortgage loan to value ratio on that property. So they're basically pretending what they were bought at is actually what they're worth. Now, banks were doing this when the gap between what investors bought and what the units were worth was kind of relatively narrow, 10, 15, maybe 20%. As that gap widens, it's getting harder to do. But even with these blanket appraisals, not every buyer can get a mortgage, even if they're given that blanket appraisal. So some are defaulting, some can't close. In some cases, the gap is too high, so the investors are just walking away and defaulting on their purchases. So one of the things that I've talked about on this show is always when you have this happening, and we've kind of heard about this, is that if too many investors default and don't close on the condominium project, there's a risk that the condominium project may not complete and register, that the whole project will just collapse if too many buyers default. This happened in the US during their financial crisis. Tons of condominiums in Las Vegas and Miami that were bought by pre-construction investors just defaulted. The projects basically failed because all those buyers just walked away from their purchases, refused to close. Now, over the past, 6 to 12 months on this channel, I've kind of suggested more recently that even though I was worried about those types of systemic risks maybe 3-4 years ago, I became less concerned about them recently. And my feeling was that many of these issues are just going to get resolved quietly. They're going to just happen behind closed doors. And I'm going to kind of unpack what I mean by that and what I'm seeing. But before I do that, I think it's important to understand why my views shifted. Even though there were these massive defaults in the US during the financial crisis, what makes Toronto and our market today different from that period is that today there's still a ton of liquidity in the market. There's still a ton of capital in the market, and there's still people looking at investing. In 2006, 2007, there was no liquidity. It's impossible to get a mortgage, impossible to get financing. People were buckling down and not lending and not investing. It was a very different market in the US back then. Today in Toronto, there are still tons of investors who have capital, a ton of capital to invest and deploy and just waiting for the right opportunities. And over the past couple of months, I've heard multiple stories of effectively family offices, which are large, kind of wealthy individuals who have a ton of capital and have a team of investors basically deploying their capital and investing, who are basically buying large blocks of condominiums in these new projects at a significant discount. So, as many of the builders have a ton of leftover inventory, either because they didn't sell them during the pre-construction phase, or some of the original buyers have defaulted. These deep-pocketed investors are coming in and say, okay, great, I'll buy an entire floor, I'll buy 10 units, I'll buy 20 units. And of course, at a significant discount from what those units originally sold for. But again, it's pumping money into the project, allows the builder to sell them, allows them to close the project, and to move on and to register the building. So again, these dynamics are really just happening quietly behind closed doors. And this is kind of what I meant over the past 6-12 months when I said that the market's likely going to solve this quietly between these relatively, again, these are not, when I talk about investors, I'm talking about like mom and pop investors. When the mom and pop investors are distressed, which is happening now, it is the larger, more corporate, more sophisticated investors that step in to take advantage and buy at distressed prices. And those are very different dynamics. That is what is happening today, and what is stabilizing the pre-construction or the new construction condo market right now. So, does this mean no project's going to fail? I mean, of course not. We can't predict the future. Maybe, one or two projects that where there's a huge gap between what they sold for and what they're worth may have challenges, may default. But it looks like it's unlikely to be this massive systemic problem, where there are tens or hundreds, tens of, maybe 20 or 30 condo projects fail, is probably unlikely, again, because there's tons of capital ready to invest and buy these units in bulk. So I think this is the most likely thing that is going to keep the market balanced. And again, I think there's a lot of incentive, even both from politicians, from our banks, to kind of ensure they can do everything possible to stabilize the condo market, to avoid these types of defaults, because these types of defaults lead to, broader concerns, systemic risks. And I think between the institutions and, again, many of these larger, more sophisticated investors, they're going to probably do everything possible to keep the condo market afloat, to avoid defaults, to kind of keep prices stable. So that's what I'm seeing more recently. And I think this is why sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect from what we think is going to happen in the market from what is actually happening, because some of the dynamics of what's happening isn't in front of us. These properties are not on the MLS. They're not traded on the MLS. All of these transactions are happening quietly, behind closed doors, and in bulk. And it's actually very hard to even look them up on the land registry. It takes a lot of effort. So again, sometimes when we see these disconnects from what we think will happen or is going to happen versus what is actually happening, it's due to some of these underlying, less transparent dynamics. Hopefully you found that helpful. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.